And then now I will hit start webinar and folks should start coming in. All right. Yep. People are starting to join. Good evening, friends. Thank you for joining. We're going to continue to let folks sign in as they can. And as we do that, I want to welcome you all. My name is Roger Hutchison, and I am the Director of Christian Formation and Parish Life here at Palmer. And I am pleased to welcome not only the Reverend Neil Willard, who has been away this summer on sabbatical. And so it is great to have him back with us here. And of course, our guest tonight, Rabbi Sandy Eisenberg Sasso. I want to take just a second to say what a special treat this is for me. You know, when you get to share somebody special with those you care about, she is very special to me personally. I had the opportunity of hearing Sandy at of all things, a Christian formation conference. We had a Jewish rabbi at a Christian formation conference, and what she taught me changed the way I did formation. And then Sandy wrote the foreword to my very first book. So I have a special connection, and I hope you will enjoy this evening. I want to share a bit of her biography, but a couple of housekeeping things before I do. We are going to go for about 40 minutes, and then at that point, we'll begin a Q&A session time. And the way that I'm going to ask you to do that is to put your question in the Q&A box for me or in the chat box for me, and then I will take care of getting those questions to our guests. And so we'll do that. So at this point, let me introduce officially and welcome Rabbi Sandy Eisenberg Sasso. Sandy is currently the director of the Religion, Spirituality, and Arts Initiative at IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute, which is a mouthful, which stands for Indiana University, Purdue University. And that was combined, I think, in 1969 is what I understand. Sandy is Rabbi Emerita of Congregation Beth-El Zedeck in Indianapolis, where she served from 1977 to 2013. She was the second woman ever to become a rabbi and was ordained by the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in 1974. She currently serves as the director of the Religion, Spirituality, and Arts Initiative at the place that is a mouthful, so I'm not going to say that whole IUP, that place. And she is past president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association, Gleaners Food Bank, a past chair of the Spirit and Place Festival. She serves on numerous boards, including the Indiana Humanities Council, and is a co-founder of Women4Change in Indiana. Rabbi Sasso has been honored as one of the influential women in Indiana by the Indianapolis Business Journal and was featured among Indy's most influential clergy. She is recipient of the Sagamore of the Wabash, Touchstone Award from Girls Inc., Heritage Keepers Award from the Indiana State Museum, and the Spirit of the Prairie Award from the Conner Prairie Interactive Park. The author of many articles and nationally acclaimed children's books, which is where I have my connection and some of my very favorite books for children. I will encourage you to please check her out. Rabbi Sasso, and this is a big deal, is winner of the National Jewish Book Award and a 2018 recipient of the Eugene and Marilyn Glick Indiana Authors Award. She received her BA and MA from Temple University and her DMin from the Christian Theological Seminary. So as a mouthful, there's a lot there. And so I am going to turn this over now to the Reverend Neil Willard. And again, Rabbi Sasso, Sandy, thank you. I'm glad you're here.
Thanks, Roger. And welcome, Sandy. It's a great honor to be able to have this conversation with you. You know, one of the things that people heard in that introduction about you is the fact that you ordained a rabbi in Reconstructionist Judaism. And it occurred to me that a lot of folks here in Houston who are listening now or will be listening later to this conversation are somewhat familiar with Reform Judaism because of a neighboring synagogue on the other side of the campus of Rice University, which our church also borders. But I'm guessing that most of them may not have heard about Reconstructionist Judaism. And I'm just wondering if you could give us a thumbnail sketch of that stream of Jewish life, or tell us just something about that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And first, let me thank you for inviting me to this conversation. And I do especially want to thank Roger, who I met at this conference, watched him painting on the table. And we had a real interesting rapport. And I can't believe it's been quite a number of years and we still stayed in touch. And I'm very grateful for that friendship. So I thank him a great deal, and it's so nice to meet you. So Reconstructionism could take up this whole session, so
right, I understand.
Try to avoid that. So there are 4 large movements in Judaism. All of them come out of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution and the emancipation in Europe. Before that, there were not that people disagreed with each other, lots of different strands, but not movements. So Reconstructionism is the first American-born movement. The other 3 movements, Reform, Conservative, and Orthodoxy, begin in Europe and then come to America and adapt their particular perspective to the American soil. Reconstructionism actually began in America. And the simplest way to explain it is how it defines Judaism. Reconstructionism defines Judaism as the ever-evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. So there are a number of components to that definition. One, it's evolving. It's continuing to change as community changes, as time changes. It responds to historical conditions. It has a faith. There is an understanding of God, which I will explain a little bit differently than some of the other movements. And most of all, it emphasizes civilization, that Judaism is more than but more than a religion, more than a faith. It is a civilization, which means that it contains a culture, often more than one culture. It has a language, it has rituals, it has those things that bind people together. So while religions have behaving, belonging, and believing, all those 3 elements, in Reconstructionism, the most important element is belonging. Mm-hmm. So one way to understand that is to understand how Reconstructionism talks about Torah or revelation. Reconstruction, normally, the traditional way of looking at revelation and how we receive Torah, Jewish teachings and tradition, is God gave the Torah, and I don't just mean the first 5 books, gave the Torah, all of Jewish teaching, to the people. God revealed Torah to the people. Reconstructionism turns that upside down. The people, in their search for God, created Torah. So it begins with the community. And because it's the community in searching for meaning and purpose and salvation and the divine that create Torah, that Torah is always ongoing and being created. It's never finished.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I think our Episcopalians can.
That's enough. I could say more, but
relate to the, rooted in the past, but responding to the present, and curious about the world as it is. And also that sense of community. I hope we'll come back to that several times, maybe in our conversation, talking about faith formation and talking about God and children and so forth. And I guess first of all, I'm just curious, how did you first start writing books for children, and why did you want to do that, and specifically relating that to God?
Well, actually, I first started writing books for children in a Christian seminary, so that may come as a surprise. I was taking doctor of ministry classes at Christian Theological Seminary, which is a Disciples of Christ seminary in Indianapolis. And I thought, gee, I work with kids a lot in the synagogue. Maybe I'll just take a class in religion and children and see what they have to teach me. And I had some assignment that I was not keen on. And I remember saying to the professor, you know, I cannot find any books about God that I really want to share with my congregation and my own children.
Sure.
So do you mind if I just, like, for my paper, try to write something? That was a paper that ultimately became my first book, God's Paintbrush. And it was an effort to talk about God with kids in a way that didn't preach, but a way that helped them see the divine in the everyday and opened up a conversation. Did not close it, but opened them up. In fact, it's a series of vignettes in which kids can see God in, you know, breaking a vase and hiding,
Right.
and moving away, a variety. And every vignette ends with a question because it's meant to provoke a conversation. And that's how I started. And most of my books are in part to answer my own questions. You know, I could preach theology to my congregation and hide behind all the big words, you know, and what all the theologians said. And most of the congregants would shake their heads and say, well, yeah, that's fascinating. Yes, I guess you went to seminary. And then when I could write it for children in language that children could understand, that's when I really understood it. It was my way of coming to have a deeper appreciation for what I was spouting with fancy language. And when I would share that with the congregation, they would say, oh, now I get it. Now I know what you believe. So yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned that, like something as simple as breaking a vase and running away. And that reminded me of something, because it seems to me that not only children, but also adults, when they're curious about the world around them and about the people around them, or they're feeling deeply about the things that are happening throughout the day, that they're often having an experience of God, even if that's not the language that they would use to talk about them, or they may not even think they believe in God. But, how do you help people name God or name the divine in the midst of those kinds of experiences? And maybe as a related question, it occurred to me when you were describing that book, for example, do you ever feel like you're writing something for children, but you're doing it knowing that the adults are overhearing it? I think that was a homiletical strategy of St. Augustine, actually. I'm talking to the new Christians, but I know that the old Christians are listening to me. Do you ever think about things like that on that level? Or
there's a category called children's books that are not for children only. And I always felt that in many ways I was writing that way. I was taking a very difficult concept, one that I was having trouble giving expression to, and finally coming to understand it in a way that I could express it, and hopefully that would invite other people into the conversation. Excuse me. So the question was, how do I get people to talk about God? So actually my first experience, I credit another Christian conference that I went to. It was on children's spirituality. And I said, well, if I'm going to write a dissertation on it, I better go to the conferences and hear what's going on. And of course I had a great big notebook, and I was going to take all the notes so I could footnote it in my paper, right? And then all of a sudden in the conference, the leader said, okay, I want you to put all your papers away, and I want you to go off in a corner, and I want you to think of the first spiritual experience you ever had. Now, my first reaction was, oh my God, that's a waste of time. I mean, please tell me, give me the information, And during that time, I came up with an experience that I had long ago forgotten. And I have used that to kind of explain my first encounter with the divine. And the experience is very simple. I lived on the East Coast. I lived in Philadelphia, and my family would always go down to Atlantic City, to the Atlantic Ocean in the summer. My father would only come on the weekends because he worked during the week. And I loved the ocean, and I loved jumping in the waves. But one day I was toppled by a large wave, and I realized this was not a particularly safe place. Mm-hmm. My father came down on the weekend and noticed I stopped running into the waves. Oh. And he didn't say a word.
Right.
He just picked me up in his arms and he carried me over the waves until I was able to stand in them again. And that experience was a way for me to understand, God as those hands which carry me over those difficulties until I'm able to stand up on my own again. So I think what happens, and the reason people are reluctant to talk about theology and spiritual life, is they think they don't have the right vocabulary.
Right.
And we do not have to use the vocabulary of the theologians. I mean, you and I might have to do that. We're seminary trained, right? But we don't have to do that. We need to find those moments in our lives that touched us so deeply and that transformed the way we looked at the world and call them sacred. And I think we especially need to do that with our children, because when I would ask kids often in my congregation, where do you experience God? Synagogue. In services. And I'm thinking, of course. I said, no, stop for a minute. Where else? We kind of identify the sacred and the holy and faith, which places of worship. But I want our kids and adults to recognize that it's all around us, but we don't always pay attention to it.
Right.
I could make reference. I don't know if you want to interrupt this, but right now, my arts and religion seminar is studying Jacob's dreams. Mm-hmm. And the first dream.
This is with adults, right? This is with
adults. We have 12 artists. They're poets, sculptors, photographers, painters, and musicians. And we study a particular biblical text through the eyes of all the arts. And then they are required to create something new.
Fun.
So the passage that comes to mind is the latter dream of Jacob. He's running away from Esau, from whom he has stolen the birthright in a very devious fashion, basically lied to his father, and he's afraid, and he stops for the night, and he has a dream of a ladder with angels going up and down. When the night is over, he wakes up and he says, God was in this place and I did not know it. And what's striking about the verse in Hebrew, there's really two I's. It says God was in this place and I did not know it. And so the rabbis asked the question, why did they say I twice? It says, because perhaps he didn't know it because his ego got in the way. So how do we get out of the way so that we actually can come in touch with something more transcendent?
Let me ask you a question related to that, that I heard you touch on in another interview, and I had already written out my own question from my perspective. I thought, well, it's an interesting intersection, because in the Episcopal Church, when people are baptized, whether they are children or whether they are adults, there is always a prayer that is offered afterwards from the Book of Common Prayer for them to be given the gift of joy and wonder in all God's works. And I have always loved that image of being given the gift of joy and wonder. And I feel like we see that most naturally and easily in children, but then it just kind of gets squeezed out of us as we grow up and become real adults, so to speak. And so I feel like one of the things that a community of faith is meant to do is to continually recall us to that sense of joy and wonder as we look around at the world around us. And is that also maybe a gift children give back to us who are a little older?
Well, that's another reason I write for kids, because it's a great joy. I mean, you come back in touch with sort of this childhood innocence and sense of wonder and this rich imagination. And this sense of surprise that we've kind of lost as adults. So what you said, I was going to look for some of these notes that I had about a study that was done in creativity that speaks right to your question. There was a NASA study done on creativity, and they did it with different age groups. So 92% of the children that they tested who were 4 to 5 years old scored at a genius level of creativity. 5 years later, only 30%.
I totally believe that. Yes.
5 years later, 12%, and adults 2%. So I want to sort of get some of that creativity from children, and they help me imagine things that I on my own may not have paid attention to. They point out things if you pay attention to them.
Yeah, of course, we love NASA here in Houston. And one of the things that I love about being at a university parish in particular is that you do pick up a sense of this, and because of the kind of the neighborhood that we're in and so forth, the sense of curiosity, scientific curiosity, intellectual curiosity, that I think is really different than a lot of other settings. And I really, again, to help people make those kinds of connections, but also to see, gosh, we see that kind of curiosity in children. And I don't know, I just feel like that's a real source of encouragement for me whenever I see a gathered community of faith. Have you found any ways to kind of foster that sense of curiosity? Or
well, so I'm so happy to hear you say that, because so many people look at faith as a place where things don't change,
right,
and where they're secure and they're safe, and they're not curious. This is the one place I go to escape from everything going on that's changing around me. And of course, I don't see that in religion. Right. I see religion as helping me imagine new ways of being. I mean, really, at the core of the Jewish tradition is the story of the Exodus. Mm-hmm. And the story of the Exodus is really an exercise in imagination. Why? Because slavery had always been. And the way the world was constructed until then, there was always an oppressor and an oppressed. It took an act of imagination to think the world didn't have to be that way, and there could be freedom. So I always think that initial act of freedom was an act of the imagination. And that's at the core of who we are. And look, there's so many different ways we can do that. We can be outside in nature. It's not just being in these places. We all know that we take a walk in nature, we enjoy it, we watch the birds, and etc. But we need to acknowledge those moments as sacred moments. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to, if we're working with children, we need to say, this is a special time. I'm feeling something, extraordinary here. It's not like ordinary time. And I don't think we often do that. And sometimes children will say things to us that I consider prayers, but we don't tell them they are.
Right.
And
that's sort of the missing part, isn't it? Right. Yeah.
Then they think prayer is, oh God, please give me an A on my test, because nobody tells them these other ways of speaking, like naming your greatest fear,
right,
or your greatest joy. That is a form of prayer.
It's funny you mentioned that. So I was on sabbatical, as Roger mentioned, over the summer. One of the things that I had an opportunity to do was go on a road trip with our two boys. The three of us had never done that together. They're now in 6th grade and 9th grade. And we were driving through Tennessee on our way to Western North Carolina. And one of the things that I did with them in the evening was to ask them a couple of questions that I answered also. And the first was, what's something you're grateful for today? Mm-hmm. And then the second one was, what was one of the most interesting things about today? And then after we had talked about these things, I would close with a prayer, and it was usually something from the Book of Common Prayer. And what I liked about that exercise was that it was simple, about as simple and as inviting and invitational as it can be at the end of the day, without being overly complicated, and just sort of inviting them into that kind of a conversation, and that really anyone could do.
So I think that's a wonderful exercise, but something that's easy for people who are a little apprehensive is read a story. You don't have to make up the story. There are plenty of amazing stories out there. And then don't tell your child what the story means, because you're only saying what it means to you. I know this is the home of Jerome Berryman, so you may all know this, but I usually use the 4 questions he asks in Godly Play. You know, the first one being, what did you like the best? Second, what is most important? What do you think was most important? And the third one, which is my favorite, where are you in the story, or what part of the story is about you? And then there's a 4th question of what can you do without and still have enough of the story? But it's the 3rd question that gets you to a deeper place and allows the child to tell you what they are thinking. Many times what I was thinking of story is not at all what a child was interested in.
And that could change from day to day or chapter of life to chapter of life. You know, I certainly a lot of American Christians are locked, especially Protestants, get locked into well, there's only one answer to that. There's only one answer, but it's always changing from day to day, depending on what you're going through. But I love the idea of noticing something unusual in a story. And I do remember one conversation in a class about sermons, and it was talking about not just the different perspectives of the people in a story, but let's say in a Christian context, you're talking about a story about the resurrection. What about the ointment that the women brought to the tomb? And you could imagine things from that perspective. What were they used for beforehand? What would they have seen? And I think sometimes children can pick up on that kind of different perspective quicker than adults can. Have you ever been surprised by what a child, like you said, latched onto?
Yes. I once told, I used a section from God's Paintbrush, which was saying what an echo is. And I asked the kids in the class, how are you like God's echo? And this one and so I figured, they're going to tell me something very concrete. And one child says, an echo doesn't have to be a sound. I go, whoa, you got it. That is so amazing. And then I've done that. So another book that I'm quite fond of is the book I wrote in God's Name, where everybody calls God by a different name. Each person thinks the name that he or she chose was better than the others until they come to recognize all the God names are good and they call God one. So, and they're not always the traditional names, Sure. God is called mother and friend. So I would ask kids afterwards and adults, I've done this with adults, can you tell me, can you go off on your own, spend a few moments and figure out your name for God or what metaphor you would use? And I've gotten amazing answers. So I decided to use it on my grandchild. He was becoming a bar mitzvah, and he said, "Well, I don't know if I believe in God, or everything." And so I said, "Do you know what a metaphor is?" And he goes, "Of course I do." I said, "Okay, let's think. What would you think might be a metaphor for God?" I was blown away. He said, "I think God is the ocean and I am the wave." Now, this is a child who was he's older now, was only just turning 13.
Right. What advice do you give to people who's, say, older children or their teenagers are struggling with ideas about God, or what they really think about that, what they really think about a community, whether they want to belong to a community, whether they believe in God? There's a lot of anxiety in parents about things like that.
Yes. And you know what? I would be delighted that a young adolescent was struggling with the question, because so I'm very partial to John Westerhoff's Stages of Faith. I understand he passed away just this last year. So I thank him for this, because I use it all the time. That the simplest way is there's experience faith, that which you just experience in your home because you see what your parents do, and that's experiences. Right. The second is affiliative faith, which is you then become part of a community. And you go to the church, you go to the synagogue, you go to Sunday school, and you learn what the community believes in. And then there is a stage, if you're going to come then to the last stage, the owned faith, meaning it's not just the community's faith, but mine, you need to go through a period of searching. If you don't, it's not really yours.
Mm-hmm.
It's what your community told you, and you're just saying, okay, I'll accept that. But if you're thinking, then you do doubt and you do question. So, I would say celebrate that, but don't stop. Meaning that I'm not sure I believe this, so I'm leaving.
I'm done with that, right?
Yeah, and I had a child tell me that mother said he doesn't want to come to Sunday school. He doesn't believe anything anymore. So I said, okay, he doesn't have to believe anything about God that we've taught him. However, he does have to figure out that he does believe. And this is a good place as any to do it. Meaning encourage the search, give them examples. There's a beautiful book for adults called The History of Doubt. And it is Jennifer Hecht is the author. And she shows how in every tradition, some of the major thinkers doubted and asked questions. And I just want to say, hey, you're in great company with a long tradition. We have people who struggled. And you can even go back to the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel. I mean, it's that struggle that gave him the name Israel. So
even in the Roman Catholic tradition, Mother Teresa, of course, sort of famously afterwards, people came to realize the tremendous struggles that she went through, like in her prayer life and all, that people would not have thought was the case. But that's actually kind of encouraging to a lot of people, because they think about the own struggles that they've had in their own life.
No, absolutely.
I have a question about thinking about children's stories versus adult stories. And there is one story in particular that I think about, certainly in the Christian context. In the Christian world, if I were to refer to Noah in the book of Genesis, I mean, the very first thing that would come to mind are beautiful little miniature arcs with all sorts of cute little, just love it. It just warms my heart. Oh, and you just picture children would just automatically play with the animals and all, but and that's before we go back and read the story in the pages of Genesis, and it doesn't really seem like a story for children.
No,
it seems like a story for adults, and a difficult one for adults. Do you ever ask, do people ever ask you about that or things like that, as someone who deeply cares about the spirituality of children? What are adults to do with that? A lot of adults don't actually see what I just mentioned to you.
No, I understand.
If you point it out, they're like,
it's a frightening story, but I think it's a way to tell it. The story I don't tell, and I love to tell to adults. I think it's fascinating. Is the story of the binding of Isaac.
Yes.
I find that very hard to engage with kids, because it's a scary story, and I can explain it from a historical point of view what's going on here, but that doesn't work for kids. Actually, the Noah story was interesting to me, and I just decided to tell it from a totally different vantage point. One day when I was in the synagogue, I had a young girl come over to me and says, we're reading the story of Noah, but I have a question. I said, yeah. He said, who's Noah's wife? And I'm thinking, I have no answer to that. So I figured, rabbinic tradition interprets everything. So I'm thinking maybe the rabbis, as they interpreted this story over the centuries, had a name. And lo and behold, they did. Her name was Naamah, which means, excuse me, which means pleasing. And then I found a footnote. And the footnote said her name was Emzera, which means mother of seed. And I said, okay, I know the story. I was sure someone else had written it. I said, Noah's wife, no one else wrote it. Noah's wife gathered all the seeds and plants and planted them on the ark in a garden. And after the flood, replanted the earth's garden.
That's really beautiful. Yeah. And I can see how you can put things in a big frame, because I think like the German theologian Jürgen Moltmann says something like, if God were to turn away from creation, you would have disaster, but God promises not to do that, something like that. But it's when you get down into the weeds, all of a sudden people are like, maybe I won't read this to my kids or something like that.
No, it's a very powerful story in a time of climate change.
Sure. Yeah.
So if theologically, I think it's problematic to say God brought the flood and killed all those people, men, women, and children, not just the bad guys, but everybody who was there. That's a very troubling theological concept. But the idea that people can so treat the earth and one another that they can destroy it, that is a real situation that we're confronting. And the question we ask today, is there an ark to save anyone?
Yeah.
So that's a really powerful story. Now, I wouldn't do that with kids, obviously,
right.
But that we could talk about, what do we do to mess up the earth?
Right.
And kids know that right away.
We might come back to things we could do in the home, but again, thinking about a gathered community, years ago when my wife and I lived in Minnesota, we happened one night in our home overhear our oldest son, who was 3 years old at the time, saying the words of the Lord's Prayer by himself in his own room at bedtime. Now, this was both heartwarming and very surprising. And the reason it was very surprising is because we had not actually taught him these words one-on-one. So he had overheard these words in worship Sunday after Sunday while supposedly not paying attention, while playing with crayons and things like that. And it was really a striking moment of it was like a holy moment, really. Well, but you know, what is really going on in a gathered community, even when children don't look like they're paying attention, but they are hearing things? Or how do you think about that? Or what are some things you have observed?
Yeah, I think that's so true. And then we don't. So one thing that we would do on Friday nights is light Sabbath candles. Now my husband and I are both rabbis, so you realize this is not the quietest moment of the week, because we have to go to services, and but we're gonna light those candles. We're gonna say those blessings. And as the kids got older, I think they're not paying attention. They want to go do this, do that. And I figured, maybe this is a waste of time. And when I remember when our son, who was our oldest, went to college, the first Friday night he was in college, he called us. So would you mind if we could light the candles together?
Wow.
So you think you're not making an impact, but repetition over and over again. What mattered was that this was a moment where family cared for one another, and it was a pause in a hectic time. He wanted that sense of togetherness and warmth in family, and that's what the lighting the candles symbolized. And even though you think they're not paying attention, they're paying attention.
And that's something that's taking place in the home, but in your case, before, you're also going to gather as a community afterwards, right? And I wondered about that. I was saying before we started this that my paternal grandfather belonged to a somewhat peculiar small Christian tradition called the Primitive Baptists. And one of the unusual things is that they did not, quote unquote, believe in Sunday school in the sense of kind of an organized religious education, because they believe that should be taking place in the home and what we might say today, not outsourced to other people. Now, I don't believe in the way they frame that, and yet there are so many Christians that really, in a sense, do that. Like they do kind of outsource that and think, well, someone else, it's going to take from someone else, and therefore I'm not going to worry about what I do at home. But again, how do you encourage people to bring that home in ways that they will actually do, not overly complicated ways they think they want to do and then they'll never do it, but in something where they actually practice something?
Yeah, so it's so interesting, that you say that, because, when I was full-time at the synagogue and on Sunday mornings, I would often get Sunday school teachers coming desperately to my office saying, "The children asked about God." I said, "Yeah." It says, "I can't answer those questions. You'll have to come in and do it for me." And I said, no, you don't understand. They don't want to hear from me. They want to hear from you. You're their teacher. And I also have encouraged, I say the same thing about parents. You don't take them to their minister or the rabbi. I mean, that's totally fine, but they want to know what you think.
Sure.
And okay, you're going to say, "Hey, I'm not an expert. What do I know?" So here's what I am always reminded of. An amateur built Noah's Ark, right? Noah was an amateur. The people who built the Titanic were experts. So you don't have to be an expert. Mostly what kids want to know is what you're thinking. And I always say, you don't have to have the answers. This is not a Google question. This is a very big question. And if you can help your kids understand that the question they're answering has been debated for centuries and is a big question, and what you want to do is let's explore that together. What are you thinking? I will tell you what I am thinking. The worst thing you can do is give them one answer as though there's one answer to that question. But as far as, what do you do to help kids have those kinds of spiritual experiences? I think rituals are very important. Simple rituals, not complicated. I mean, lighting Sabbath candles has a line that's a prayer. It's not difficult to do. Saying a blessing over our bread takes a moment. Just these smaller moments that are set aside from what you do every day, routine, make an impression even though you don't see it. A bedtime ritual is really important, I believe. And we used to always say the traditional Jewish prayer, the Shema, which says, "Hear, O Israel, the eternal are God, the eternal is one." And our kids, when they had their kids, I'd be in their home and I'd hear them doing it with their kids. There's this continuity and there's this moment that says, okay, to go to sleep, we need a moment in which we think about something beyond ourselves and all the stresses of the day and what's going to happen tomorrow. And we're going to do this together. Doesn't have to be complicated.
I wonder if that sense of connection too, I'm thinking back to something we were talking about earlier. Like I of course, we love rituals in the Episcopal Church. We lean heavily in that direction. And a lot of our liturgy, especially the kind of liturgy we do at Palmer, is very much like Isaiah in the temple. I mean, it's all that. It's that kind of experience where you really do have a sense of the mystery and the majesty of God that you're standing before. Some Episcopalians can kind of reverse the arrow where you make that the end, like I have arrived and I'm standing before the mist, as opposed to the starting point. Like I have encountered the mystery and the majesty of God. And now I'm being sent out into the world, including the world of my home. It's not just the streets, but it's even, walking back into my home. I've been sent there also. And I do think—
You reminded me of this Jewish ritual that it's very simple, but has a powerful message. So, at the entrance to every Jewish home, there is something called a mezuzah, which is just a little cylinder. And inside the cylinder, there's some verses from scripture. And they're rolled up inside, and it's supposed to be put on the right-hand side of the right-hand doorpost, and it's supposed to be put slanted inward. So of course the rabbi said, why slanted? Why not, horizontal or vertical? And actually the answer is that there was a big debate. And one rabbi said, no, you should put it standing up because it says you should say the Shema, the prayer I mentioned to you, when you get up in the morning. Another says, oh, no. It says you should say it when you go to sleep at night. So it should be lying down. And you know what happened? They compromised. And so that's why it's slanted in. And so if you know this story, at the entrance to every home is a symbol of compromise.
Oh,
and
interesting.
When you walk into your home, you're technically supposed to sort of kiss the mezuzah. What that says, okay, I'm going to be in this environment. There are a lot of people who don't always agree with each other here. I have to learn the art of compromise. So something as simple as an object that has a story attached to it.
Connection like that.
Makes the connection,
Well, there's one of the questions that was sent to me here from someone who's watching this says, you speak of many things that sound spiritual to me, like if I'm reading about spirituality and all. And then there's a question that's sort of in Christian language. I'm trying to figure out how to translate.
I might understand it. I've been in seminary.
Does your faith contain the concept of a present and accessible Holy Spirit? So the presence of God in the midst of these things you're talking about or wrestling with.
So there's a concept in Judaism, called Ruach Elohim, which basically means the Spirit of God. It's not, not like the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, but the Spirit of God that hovers over the waters. And of course, there is a sense of, now the word for soul in Judaism is both neshama and nefesh. And the word comes from the word for breath. Mm-hmm. So that when we breathe, in a sense, we are enlivening our soul. It's also the breath of the spirit of the universe that pulses through us.
Do you think about that when you're reading stories sometimes, or?
Gosh, when I do stories, I just want to be a really good storyteller.
Sure.
And that's very different than preaching. I mean, I did a lot of preaching when I was the rabbi in the pulpit. Right. And it's very different than storytelling. And since I write children's books, I see how different it is. A story, first of all, has to have a certain rhythm to it. Mm-hmm. It needs to catch your attention. It needs to have a bit of a conflict, and it needs to somehow resolve together. So I'm always trying to get the story that's going to call people to attention. The words in Hebrew for attention are sim lev, which means to give your heart. To pay attention is to give something of your heart to the moment. And that to me is a spiritual experience. Mm-hmm. So if we have a minute, I often try to talk a little bit about the difference between religion and spirituality, because those terms are like thrown around all the time. So very simply, when Moses went up to Mount Sinai, he had a spiritual experience. I mean, it says his face glowed. Mm-hmm. When he came down from the mountain, he had the 10 Commandments. That's religion. Up on Mount Sinai, he had a spiritual experience, a sense of transcendent beyond himself. And the container for that experience were the commandments. Mm-hmm. And what's the commandments? And that is religion. And Sinai, without the 10 Commandments, is just another mountain. Meaning that if you don't have words or rituals to hold that, it dissipates. So, it's I love spiritual experiences. I love to help, foster them, but they need containers to hold them, or they evaporate. And that's where I see, religious ritual having a role.
Right.
Now, it's possible that the ritual forgets the experience.
Well, I was going to ask, is it possible for someone to think they have the words, but they're missing Sinai?
Right. So that's exactly it. You can have an empty container without that breath, right? So it says, how do you maintain? But you can also have the breath. You have no way to talk about it.
But to your point earlier, I was really struck by a quote. I think it was from John Levinson, who teaches at Harvard Divinity School, I think, about tradition. It was Jewish, but I loved, because again, it reminded me of the Episcopal Church liturgy about. One of the values of tradition as in rituals is that when you're going through a difficult time, it can carry you through like a life preserver until you feel like you're standing on solid ground again. And I do think about that a lot in my context.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Now we've talked about some of your books. I know you gathered some of them before.
I have them right here.
Would you like to read something from one of them, or just show us what they are?
Well, I'll show you two. I can read tons of them. This is, I think, one of my newest books. It's called The Good for Nothing Tree. And I know you've had Amy Jill Levine on here. Right. So this is co-authored with her. So you have a rabbi and a Jewish New Testament professor writing on parables now.
Awesome.
Without being surprising.
Right.
So this is based on the parable of the fig tree. And it's often used in a negative way to Jews, that the fig tree that doesn't bloom is supposed to be the people of Israel. And no. and that's what happens. You can take a story like that and you can teach it in a way that causes bigotry.
Sure.
The question is not just what the story is, but how we communicate it. And we have a responsibility to communicate it in a way that helps for greater understanding and appreciation of one another. And sometimes we don't do that. Mm-hmm. So the way we tell this story is there's this fig tree and it doesn't grow and all the adults go get rid of it. It's a waste of your energy, plant a new tree. And their kids come around and say, no, you know what? I think it needs a little nurturing. I think it needs a little time, and it takes them a long time, and they take care of it, and they weed it, and they water it, and it starts to grow finally. And the gardener, who was about ready to uproot it, says, "You were right." So at the end, it says, we can see, so each day they come, they have the leaves. And the reason they love, this is what it says at the end. It took so long to grow, one child sighed. "You were right to be patient," the gardener said. "That is how it is with some trees." And a second child said, "It isn't just some tree, it's our tree, and it needed us." The third child added, "It needed love." The fourth smiled, and it loved us back. "I'm glad we waited," the fifth child said. "We never gave up."
Wow.
And so in the back of the book, besides having a recipe for fig balls that you can eat under the tree, not mine, but somebody who knows how to do these things, it's a whole question. Do you ever feel like you're taking too long to grow up? What can you do when somebody seems to be taking more time than everybody else in the class? How do we care for one another? And do we all grow at different times? And are we ever impatient? I mean, it raises some really important questions, particularly as kids are growing. Some grow up really fast and they're really good at sports, and some like, oh my God, they still still klutzy. Questions, how do we honor each child in the way in which they are growing? So I really like this. This was a fun book to do.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for telling us about that one. And you were talking about different interpretations, but also made me think about different kinds of stories too, outside of our traditions, like even difficult stories, maybe helping our children navigate or see the value in looking at them. I just recently finished listening to the new translation. There's a new translation of the Odyssey that actually our oldest son's going to be reading this fall. And I listened to it. I really loved it. And part of me thought of something you had mentioned. Wow, this, kings and slavery. It just feels like it's always been a part of the world. But then later in the story near the end, there's this moment where Odysseus is like, I'm just so offended by all these things that happened while I was gone in my household, and look at all this waste, all the animals that were taken. And at first I'm like, oh, this is really nice. So just kind of named that or whatever. And then he says, but so now I'm going to have to go raid other Greeks to replenish my sheep. And I thought, but you just said that was just the worst, awful thing that could have happened. And now you're going to do it to multiple people. But I thought, it's good to read that story and think about that.
No, absolutely. And that's why I think every story needs to be followed by a series of questions. Like, right. How do you feel about that? What do you think? What would you have done in that person's situation? Take on a different character whose voice doesn't get heard and tell the story from that person's point of view. That's a very rich tradition in Judaism called midrash, which is a way of interpreting text, is to expand it and help tell new stories over the old stories. Gosh, there's so much more I could say, but I am going to pause.
Someone has a question about, I've always considered and heard that the art of compromise is otherwise known as politics, and that's a skill that we should impart to our children. He says, surely not, but he's just curious, like, what do you think we should be imparting to our children?
Oh, politics? Not at this point, no. Yeah.
Think about the world. How are they to relate to other people, maybe, but.
Oh, gosh. I think the way we do that best is by modeling it. We can tell our children, oh, be nice to the new kid at school. Your neighbor seems lonely. Why don't you go over and play? Nothing works as well as children watching you do what you want them to do. Just in terms of, do you, bake a batch of cookies to take to your neighbor when your neighbor's sick? Do you recycle, your plastic? Do you volunteer at the soup kitchen? What do what happens when, you see a herd animal on the road? I mean, you are constantly modeling for children. So of course there's things that we can say, and we can say, what did you think when you did that? How do you think the other person felt? But I think we model. And the second thing, and this is part of Robert Cole's teaching, stories. We can't put children in morally difficult situations, or we certainly don't want to, but we can help them experience them through narrative. And through narrative, they develop a sense of empathy, and they also discover, what do you do when you confront a challenge, just like the characters in this story? Here's a way through it. So I would say modeling and stories.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, this is so good. This is so good. No, I wanted to come on and say that for Christian educators and for Jewish educators, and we're coming out of COVID and this season where I've been doing this now for 30 years, and I'll be 50 this year. And I've been doing this for 30 years. And the hardest season of my life as a Christian educator has been the past 3 years. It has been difficult to connect with families in a way. It's been difficult to, I've tried every way that I can think of. And some folks said, we just aren't going to do that right now. Or some folks said, please send me a box that has everything I need in it. And, on and on and on. So those kinds of things. We're beginning to gather again. And so we tried this summer to gather, and I just kind of didn't know what to do. And then I decided, you know what, I'm going to order breakfast tacos and we're going to Texas, and we're going to gather on the playground. And so I offered breakfast tacos before church, and people started gathering. Children started coming, families started coming, and out of that came the most beautiful formation of just kind of being together again. And so I love that. And what I would love to hear from you, I told you I was going to ask you this, is coming out of this into this new way of being the church, new way of being the synagogue, new way of being people of faith. What does that look like now? How do we go forward? What does it look like?
Well, I would say we need each other more than ever. The world is more frightening than I remember it. Our kids know it too. We have plenty of school shootings. Our kids have drills in their schools, and they're afraid. So we need each other. And we need something else, which is often hard to find in dark times, and that is hope. As I mentioned to Neil and Roger at the beginning, I came across a phrase that said, hopelessness is a failure of the imagination. So, and I think back to the Exodus story. If the people then couldn't imagine a life outside of being oppressed, they wouldn't have had one. So we're in a difficult stage. And of course, every generation, I think, says that, but it feels deeper right now. And we need to find that little bit of light. It's there. I don't know if you know this little rabbinic story that I find fascinating. When the sun set for the first time in creation, Adam and Eve, after they'd eaten from the fruit of tree of knowledge of good and evil, the sunset. Now, they had never experienced a sunset before, and they thought that was the end of the world. The sun was gone, it wasn't coming back again. So how did they get through the night? I'm thinking maybe we're in this night. They took two stones and they rubbed them together, and they made a spark, and they made a fire, and that fire took them through the night until the sun rose again. So we're going to have to find those two stones. And maybe it's the two of us, maybe it's two people together in community that are going to make that bit of light to get us through the dark.
Wow.
I think what a beautiful spot to sort of conclude this. I will say that this is going to sound kind of silly, but as a Christian educator, I feel a bit dehydrated, and you have provided for me yet again some hydration, and I'm grateful for that. And I hope that for those who have gathered tonight to be a part of this, that this gives you a bit of hope. It certainly does for me. It is an encouragement. It's and we will make this available for others to share. So if you want to share this with folks, with maybe your children or grandchildren, this is an important conversation to have for families, for any household, really. And so I'm grateful. And so, Sandy, you know how I feel. So I cannot thank you enough. Neil, thank you so much for tonight as well. And so if you have any additional,
good to be with you.
Yeah, thank you.
It's really nice. Nice to meet you, Neil, and good to see you again, Raja.
Wonderful. And Sandy, I'll email you shortly and be in touch. And thank you, everybody. If you have any questions or want to continue asking me some questions about this that I can share with Sandy, I'm happy to do that. Just be in touch. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.